Hello and welcome to Heartlight Vedic Astrology. I was going to go through the planetary transits or Gochara for March of 2023, and it seems like the overall theme for the month is gaining clarity and momentum. So let's get into it. Just a quick note first, the information presented here is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical, financial, professional, or life advice of any kind. If you are in need, please contact an appropriate professional for support. And then you might take a minute or so to read the rest of this disclaimer. So, dates, there's quite a bit going on. Slowly but surely shifting into new energies here. I don't think last month I mentioned that on February 20th, Rahu entered Ashwini nakshatra. I will talk about that. There's so many things to look at in astrology. Once in a while you overlook something, but so I just wanted to mention that because I don't think I mentioned that last month. Last week, just about a week ago, March 1st through the 3rd, there were two planetary wars going on simultaneously, or graha yuddhas, one between Venus and Jupiter, and the other one between Saturn and Mercury. I'll get into that. March 5th, Saturn left combustion, or asta. I'll talk about that. Yesterday, March 7th, there was a full moon in Purva Falguni nakshatra. Today is Holi, so happy Holi to you if you celebrate. March 11th, so coming up this weekend, Venus will enter Aries or Misha in Ashwini nakshatra, so that'll be a pretty big change. And then the next day, Mars enters Gemini, or Mithuna, and that's also pretty big because Mars has basically been hanging out in Taurus for almost 6 months. It did slip into Gemini for about a month and retrograded back, so Mars is ready for, new action is coming about. Then March 14th, the Sun will enter Pisces or Meena. On the same day, Saturn enters Shatabisha nakshatra. So there will be, again, Saturn is slow. It's the slowest planet, but even looking at how these planets slip into different nakshatras or lunar mansions gives a different vibe to them. March 16th, Mercury will enter Pisces. You can see there's again, quite a bit of movement. March 20th, we'll have spring equinox, so that's when the sun and the moon they have equal amounts of play during the day. The next day, we'll have a new moon in Uttara Bhadrapada nakshatra. And that same day, Venus will cross Rahu. And the next day is the beginning, March 22nd, is the beginning of Navratri, if you celebrate. March 23rd, Venus enters Bharani nakshatra. March 27th, Mars enters Ardra nakshatra. And towards the end of the month, 27th through 28th, we're going to have another planetary war, this time between Mercury and Jupiter. So we have 3 planetary wars going on this month, and I'll talk about that, what that means. Generally, what is a planetary war, and then between these 3 groups of planets, what might come out of that. And then on March 28th, Jupiter will go into combustion. So we also have planets going in and out of combustion. So I'm also going to talk about that. Because Saturn came out of combustion, Jupiter's going into combustion. Then we'll see on March 31st, Mercury is also entering Aries and Ashwini nakshatra and leaving combustion simultaneously. So, a lot to talk about. And as always, again, I tend to go into depth and really get into nakshatras, or, we call it star astrology. Nakshatra or lunar mansion astrology is actually the oldest part of Vedic astrology. I find it to be very insightful, especially when you're interested in details of things. But keep in mind that Vedic astrology normally emphasizes slow-moving planets, and those are Jupiter, Saturn, Rahu, and Ketu. But again, they're slow-moving, so if we only focus on that, we won't have much to talk about. So, in any case, not that these other things are not significant, so let's go ahead. All right, so we have 3 planetary wars going on this month. Planetary war is called graha yuddha in Sanskrit. So what is it? So I'll talk about technically and functionally what this means, and then we'll get into 3 different specific planetary wars that are going on this month. So technically what this means is that you have 2 true planets within 1 degree of each other. So what is a true planet? So a true planet is Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Sun and moon. Sun is a star, moon is a moon. Rahu and Ketu are actually technical points. They're calculations. They're not actual physical planets. So the 5 that I mentioned, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, are considered true planets. When they're within 1 degree of each other, they're basically sort of competing for the stage, so to speak, and competing with each other. And so there's, because it's a war, like any sort of war, there's a destabilization of energy and a conflict of some sort of conflict going on typically. Functionally, what this means is that, I sort of mentioned that the energy of these planets are conflicting. So what these planets represent, the type of energies that these planets represent are, at odds with each other. And there will be some fallout that happens. So the winner, there is a winner. We usually determine a winner. And this is usually the brightest planet. And usually that's Venus, because Venus is a very bright planet. Or another way to determine the winner is the planet that has the highest longitude or position in the sky as the war is going on. So again, it's more of a technical calculation type thing. So what does this mean in terms of how does it affect the planetary energy? Well, the war winner, again, they both get beat up, so it's destabilizing for both planets and what they represent. But the war winner is actually considered, because it does win, even though it's bruised and bloodied through this interaction, it is considered secondary strength, so it does gain a little bit because it won, despite all the collateral damage that happened. And the war loser is considered a primary weakness, so especially if you're the loser of a planetary war, it's considered a pretty weak position. But again, as I mentioned, both planets are scathed by the battle, so to some degree, nobody comes out a winner, but technically, it's kind of like at the end of a boxing match, like they're both beat up and their faces are swollen, but somebody ends up, they ring the bell and somebody's hand gets pulled up as like the, by the referee as like the winner, even though they're both, pretty damaged. So in any case, the 3 wars that we have going on this month. So the 2 that we had going on last week were, the first one was Venus and Jupiter, and this was in Pisces. So this one may not have actually seemed like much of a war. It was actually more of a pillow fight because Venus and Jupiter are both benefic planets. They both have good intentions, good energy, that sort of thing. They were both in Pisces. So with Jupiter being in Pisces, Jupiter doesn't is an enemy to no one. So whenever a planet is in, either Pisces or Sagittarius, because it's ruled by Jupiter, Jupiter doesn't create any drag on the planet. It doesn't, interfere with the planet's energy. And Jupiter in its own sign means that Jupiter's going to be very strong. The other thing is Venus is exalted in Pisces. So you have 2 extremely strong benefic planets together, in this watery sign of Pisces. So, probably some emotions were involved here. But again, there's not going to be this is going to be like a tiny skirmish, not particularly big, long-lasting, drawn out, dramatic, or whatever. So as an example, I think I mentioned before, I'm also a physician, and I had a patient call me in the middle of this planetary war situation last week, and her complaint was that her son went to the hairdresser and got his hair cut, and he didn't like the haircut, so he kind of flipped out and was crying and kind of threw a tantrum. And that's part of why she's been bringing the kid to me, because we've been working on that. And he's been doing dramatically better, but, she herself tends to be fairly anxious. And so, when he gets upset, she gets anxious, and they kind of, it's kind of a cycle for them. So anyway, but I mean, this is actually like Venus and Jupiter. Jupiter represents children. Venus can represent artists. So, or somebody like a hairdresser, somebody in a creative field. And, the kid got into a little tussle with the hairdresser. Is this going to be a lifelong, dramatic event that's going to shape either of these people. No, they're just going to brush it off and move on. And that's exactly what he did the next day. As he woke up and, after he got over it, and was just went on with his life, as kids do. Most kids do. So that's a kind of example of like Venus and Jupiter. The other thing is that Jupiter is the kind of wise spiritual counselor. It represents that of the planets. And Venus is the mundane, worldly counselor. So you have two counselors, benefic counselors. Like this could also be like Venus represents beloved people, or like your spouse, or, your partner. And Jupiter, can represent other things like teacher, and philosophy and stuff like that. So it could have been something like you had a fight with, or discussion, discussion, like you were fighting about like where to go on your date night or something. Like, you know what I mean? Like not like a real fight. Like it was sort of a fight, but not like, again, knock out, drag out, like, go to your corners and, it's kind of fun. So that was Venus and Jupiter. Simultaneously, which actually is a little bit more, the fact that both wars were going on simultaneously, I think is actually significant, because what that means is you had Venus, Jupiter, Mercury, and Saturn all destabilized at the same time. And even though the tussle between Venus and Jupiter was not huge, basically your counselors, right, your wise counselor and your mundane counselor were destabilized. So it could have actually meant that, maybe the other war, which I'll talk about, Mercury and Saturn, that could actually be significant. You didn't really have any help, or you didn't quite know what to do. The other thing is that, these 4 planets actually are the lords or owners of, between them, 8 different houses. So 8 houses out of 12 were basically destabilized in some way. So something shook out of this, even if it was, okay, it ended up being okay. So again, just having, even though just having the 2 wars simultaneously going on, there was actually quite a bit of instability going on last week. So the Mercury and Saturn war in Aquarius, this is the more significant, sort of more virulent of the 2. And this may actually be something that would actually result in some sort of long-lasting effect, because Saturn is the slowest moving planet. So, and Saturn represents structure. So this war might have been more significant. The thing, though, is that both of these planets at the time of the war were combust. And I'm going to talk more about combustion. Basically, what that means is that on the surface, you won't really see the effects or the presence of these planets and what they represent, but you will feel on a deeper internal level what they represent. So, and Mercury, for example, represents things like coworkers, aunts and uncles, and friends. Also like business-related people, like clients and stuff like that. Saturn represents structure, bureaucracy, also servants, employees, that sort of thing. So with these 2 going head-to-head, and I believe Mercury was the winner, again, in this case, I'm not sure that meant too much, because this is going on in Aquarius, so which is Saturn's sign. So Saturn was super strong. Mercury was sort of, driving through quickly the way it does, because it moves fast. But it was probably quite a bit of a shock, and again, ultimately it created a rift, a pretty strong rift deep within the person. So it could have been you had a fallout with a customer or a friend or a colleague, or like your, some sort of authority or bureaucracy, like maybe you're hitting your head up against some bureaucracy or red tape or something. And even though on the surface, maybe you're still hanging out with this friend, or you're still running around in circles together or whatever, professionally or personally, but on a deep level, this could have resulted in something like losing trust. So you didn't lose the friend, even if physically you didn't lose the friend, deep within you may have lost a friend or colleague because of this tussle. Actually, somebody was asking me yesterday, they happen to be a Scorpio Lugna, so rising sign, ascendant sign. And so for them, Aquarius is their fourth house of home and family, but right across from the fourth house is the 10th house of career. And so yesterday they just, asked me, what's going on with my work situation? So I said, well, probably what happened last week is that there was some interaction between you and a colleague and your boss, because the other thing is the sun was, the reason why these two planets are combust is because the sun is close by, and the sun represents authority and leadership and boss. So I said there's probably some interaction between you, a colleague, and your boss. And even though, again, they probably have to work together on some level, there's probably some trust or something was lost. And they didn't even say it. All they said was, what's going on at work? And I said, look, you might be looking, because of what happened last week, it's going to blow over, the tension's going to blow over in the next week or two once Mercury and Sun move out of Aquarius. But the thing is, because Saturn is a slow-moving planet, there was some deeper crack or, fissure that was created through this interaction. And I said, you might be considering, some sort of switch, like to get away from this like sucky colleague or whatever. It's just sort of reactionary. But I said, Saturn is involved here. So whatever this is sort of like, this is probably more of a wake-up call, or like almost like a kick in the pants. That you should really consider, if you're gonna make a move, you really want to consider something like the long-term effects and options and consequences. So it's sort of like, not just like make some quick shift to get out of there because you're, pissed off. But it's like, okay, maybe this is just a wake-up call. Maybe you're getting too complacent where you were, and it's time to really think about, like, if you're going to make a shift, something that's actually going to be beneficial for the long term, not just like to get away from this smaller situation or person or whatever. And then they were like, yes, that's exactly what happened. So I said, well, take your time and really think about, where you want to like make your move. Because the thing is, again, Saturn is the slowest moving planet, and it's all about structure, bureaucracy. And again, because this person was a Scorpio Lugna and this was all happening in the fourth house, all of this planetary war energy was beaming into their 10th house of career. Sun also represents career. So, again, for this person, it was very clear that something was going on, in the workplace. But, based on the astrology, it was kind of like, you should really consider, deeper long-term moves here that'll benefit you. And so there you go. So there's an example, but let me just see what I wrote here. So in this case, because Mercury can be a benefic planet, it can also be a malefic planet. Mercury swings though, because Mercury's a dual planet, so it's like kind of impressionable, and it kind of takes up or kind of mimics the energy that it's surrounded by. So the fact that Mercury was in Saturn, which is a malefic planet, and the Sun was there, which is a malefic planet. Mercury itself was a malefic planet at the time of this war, and all of this was dominated by Saturn because it's all happening in Saturn sign Aquarius. So you have all, three malefic planets, because the Sun's so close too. Like there's sort of three malefic planets all kind of squished together and squeezing each other. And so the other things that, because I talked about them being combust, the internal qualities of these planets are going to demonstrate themselves. So Saturn, for example, can represent things like depression, anxiety, skepticism, pessimistic attitude, structural things, and old things, maybe even outdated things. And Mercury is like thoughts, decisions, communication. But again, this is all internal. So that's where this idea of like possibly losing trust, because when you lose trust with somebody, like the internal structure changes, and then if you don't trust them, you probably won't talk to them as much or won't share as much, that sort of thing, or spend time with them as much. Physically, there might be something like, because Saturn, Mercury, and Sun were together, so medically this might show up, but it wouldn't show up like in an obvious way. It would be something internal. But Sun represents like the central nervous system, like the head and the spine, spinal cord, and Mercury represents the peripheral nerves, and Saturn represents neuromuscular issues. So, I mean, you have 3 planets, again, on top of each other, who all kind of represent some aspect of the nervous system. So I could also see somebody having a flare-up, for example, with their nervous system. It could be something like lack of coordination, or it could be depression or anxiety. It could be just general fatigue, headaches, that sort of thing. Even something like gastroparesis. So gastroparesis is a slow emptying of the stomach. And so a lot of why that happens is because either the vagus nerve, which innervates the stomach, or the small muscles in the stomach and the small intestines aren't working well, and they're not creating peristalsis, that forward movement of food and digestion. And so things will just like sit in your stomach, or it feels like it's sitting in your gut. Sometimes it even kind of backs up and people can get like nausea and vomiting, that sort of thing. But something like gastroparesis, which you can't see on the surface and you wouldn't necessarily know that somebody's dealing with, but deep within, there's a slowing down, because Saturn also represents slowing down and obstacles and stuff like that with the central peripheral nervous system. So something like that could have been going on last week. And then the third war we have going on this month, at the end of the month, between Mercury and Jupiter, that's going to be happening in Pisces. So again, I mentioned Mercury shifts depending on who it's associated with, and Jupiter is a great benefic. It's in Pisces. It's very strong. So Mercury is going to be a benefic in this place. This is going to be a lot more like the Venus-Jupiter war that happened, because, again, they're both going to be benefics at this point. Jupiter dominating the situation. But Mercury and Jupiter represent things like words and speaking, communication, thoughts, thinking, that sort of thing. But they are separate, and like Jupiter represents wisdom, whereas Mercury represents knowledge. So there might be some discussion or talk or difference of opinion, although it'll be mostly pleasant, or at least it won't be, devastating, this kind of war. There's going to be something between knowledge and wisdom, or it could even be like Mercury represents the rational mind and Jupiter represents the intuitive mind. So there could be some sort of like, how do I make decisions? Do I trust my gut, or do I, make a pros and cons list or something to make a decision, or, that sort of thing. But it shouldn't be, it should be relatively mild. And again, all of these things actually, like even the Mercury-Saturn situation, like even though that was like the kind of probably tougher one to process or digest, the fact that all this happened in Aquarius with Saturn being in it, even when, quote unquote negative things happen, when like a planet is in its own sign, it won't necessarily, we call that SWA, it's in its own sign. There's some protective effect. It won't necessarily protect the individuals that the sign or the planet represents, but it'll protect, the non-animate things. So again, whatever happened, like with the colleague potentially last week, and, thinking about a new path, again, it's actually like in the end, it might be a slow and difficult transition or journey, but in the end, you'll be better off. Again, it's just sort of like a wake-up call or a kick in the pants to, move into something new, because the universe has different plans for you, that sort of thing. So that's planetary war, and those are the 3 wars we have going on this month. I also was going to talk about Pisces, because we do have like a number of planets in Pisces, either in it, entering it, or leaving it. So Pisces is Meena in Sanskrit. The symbol of Pisces is a 2 fish swimming, but in opposite directions. So there can be a contradictory energy here. Pisces is considered a mutable sign, which means changeable. So you can see it's not stable. It's also a water sign, so there's a lot of emotional energy, creative energy associated with this sign or rashi, and it's ruled by Jupiter, as I mentioned. So it's ruled by the great benefic. So planets, when they move through Jupiter, typically don't do badly, because Jupiter isn't an enemy to any planet. The only thing is that Mercury is debilitated in Pisces. So, and because Mercury represents things like communication and travel and decision making, somebody might get a little bit wishy-washy. So when Mercury's going to move into Pisces this month, so decision making might be kind of like, you might waffle a bit. In any case, so if somebody is a Pisces rising, ascendant, or lugna, meaning Pisces in the first house, or Pisces is the first house of their horoscope, people might end up with 2 marriages. They may have a tendency towards that. Not everybody, but the reason why is that the 7th house for Pisces is going to be Virgo. Venus is debilitated in Virgo, and Venus is the planet that represents spouse and marriage. So Venus is debilitated in the 7th house for Pisces, Lugna. And then the other thing is that Virgo is ruled by Mercury, and Mercury is a dual planet. So this might be somebody who ends up, in multiple marriages. There may also be some instability at home or with education, and the reason why is because, again, Mercury is a debilitated planet for Pisces, and Mercury is the lord of the 4th house. So there might be something there. Pisces people, though, they tend to love to teach and counsel, because Jupiter is exalted in the 5th house of Cancer. Cancer is also ruled by the moon, which is like public and speaking and oration, that sort of thing. They might also tend to be good with children, because the 5th house for Pisces is again where Jupiter's exalted. So, and it's going to be, and generally Pisces rising folks, again, depends, if they have some, like Mars and Ketu in the first house, then they won't necessarily be well liked and passive. But, there's a general sort of well-liked and passive vibe, probably for most Pisces rising people. They tend to have few enemies. They might also be a bit gullible, because, again, the lord of their whole chart is Jupiter. And Jupiter, again, doesn't tend to create enemies, but they can be optimistic. It can also represent, like, children, so it can be sort of childlike, like almost a sort of rose-colored glasses type of people, and so they might end up getting snookered by those around them. Pisces people might also have an interest in medicine, because the 6th house lord is the sun. Sun represents medicine in general. And then the 12th house lord is Saturn. Saturn represents isolated places like hospitals and things like that. The other thing is that Pisces represents watery and isolated places. So I know somebody's chart, they're actually Sagittarius rising, and so Pisces ends up being the 4th house of home and family and kind of property and stuff like that. And this person owns multiple property. Again, they're going to be Sagittarius, so they're going to be a mutable sign, a dual sign. And so it's funny because they own multiple pieces of property, and all the properties are isolated and near water, like their 4th house of Pisces. And it's funny, like even one of them, they just bought the last piece of property they bought. It's like a apartment in Manhattan, so like downtown, like New York City. And somehow they found a place, and it's even hard to imagine. But it's actually quiet and sheltered, and it's near the water. Like it's somehow there are probably 3 spots like that. I'm exaggerating, but there aren't that many spots like that in Manhattan. But they happened to find the one spot that was like that. And again, their 4th house of home and family is Pisces. So there you go. I was also going to talk about combustion. So combustion, this is when a planet is very close to the sun, and what I mean by close to the sun is usually we talk about like within 9 or 10 degrees. There's some, just as a general rule, some planets can be a little bit closer or farther and it still applies, but basically within 10 degrees of the sun. And the reason why this is an issue is because essentially the light from the sun is so bright and eclipses the planet. Like you can't see the planet when it's that close to the sun, and it renders it invisible to the eye. So again, we're talking about Vedic astrology here, and this was developed, more than 5,000 years ago, before there was any technology to see things far in space. So everything was based on what they could literally see with their own eyes. And so they noticed this phenomenon, and then they noticed that, the energy shifting, in their lives. This is not to be confused, even though I'm saying it's like eclipsing, this is not to be confused. Combustion and asta, as it is in Sanskrit, is not to be confused with Rahu Ketu eclipses, like solar eclipses and lunar eclipses, because that's a different thing. That happens usually twice a year, sometimes 3 times a year, but that's a whole different phenomenon and experience. So I'm just using eclipse from like a kind of a like literal way of speaking about it, not like a functional, phenomenal way. So what happens during combustion is the outer manifestation of the planet is less. So for example, last month Saturn went combust, and I know this person and whose chart, their 4th house, which represents mother, is Aquarius. Saturn was in Aquarius at the time, and it went combust, and I said, there might be something where, this person doesn't see their mother or something like that. And it just so happens that their mother went to India. And I think they just came back as like Saturn, got out of combustion. So things like that can happen. So like if Mars was combust, for example, you can look at the signs, or the houses that are ruled by Mars in a chart, or Mars itself represents things like siblings and also enemies. So it could be that your sibling or enemy went on vacation, or you went on vacation and didn't see them, or something like that. But anyway, that's how it can manifest. The other thing, though, is that the inner qualities of the planet are more strongly present or felt. So let's talk about it, because we have 3 different planets going in and out of combustion this month. So March 5th, Saturn just left combustion. So I just gave an example of that. So, this person's mom, because their 4th house of mom was ruled by Saturn, mom went on, on a trip to the other side of the world. But it might have meant for this person also that they were experiencing more anxiety, depression, skepticism, kind of slowness, or like more kind of a more pragmatic kind of approach, worldview, or at least temporary worldview. Because again, Saturn, those are sort of properties or qualities of Saturn, so those are going to be felt more deeply. And then on March 28th, Jupiter will go into combustion. So Jupiter is like, wise and spiritual and charitable and intuitive and optimistic. But it also, Jupiter represents teacher, guru. It also represents children. So I don't know. I mean, this is the end of March. Like maybe your kids or something go to camp or spring break or something like that, or you take a trip or something like that, and maybe it gives you a little bit of space, even though you're not seeing your kids. Maybe it gives you a little bit more time and space to meditate and, just rest, so that like you can kind of regain your balance and become more, sort of intuitive and optimistic, because it's a lot, right? I mean, running after kids and stuff like that, taking care of them. So something like that could happen. March 31st, Mercury leaves Asta. So it's been in combustion for a while, leaves Asta. So Mercury is about like rational thought, analytical thought, decisiveness, thoughtfulness. So there could have been a lot of thinking without like decision making, especially because Mercury has been the last couple months, Mercury was in Capricorn, which is ruled by Saturn. Saturn's a slow-moving planet. Now it's in Aquarius. We just had the tussle with Saturn itself last week. Now it's going into, Pisces soon. It's debilitated. So what's interesting, though, is that on March 31st, Mercury not only leaves Asta, but it's moving into Aries and Ashwini. And Aries is a very different energy. Aries is all about, it's ruled by Mars, so it's going to be like action. It's going to be, starting things, initiatives, and that sort of thing. So, last couple months or so, even through most of March, you might be sort of thinking a lot, analysis paralysis, not quite sure. But then at the end of the month, beginning of April, probably start getting some traction. Probably start, getting more clear about what direction to take and actually take it at the end of the month. So that's combustion, and that's the 3 combustions we have going on in March. Okay, so I found some celebrity charts that actually embody these energies. And it's kind of funny, when I was thinking about combustion and war and stuff like that, especially war, I was like, okay, who would potentially be somebody who's kind of warlike, who's contradictory and sort of conflictual, or contradictory, and it's so funny, that was my thought, who, if I were, because I was if I'm going to look for charts that have planetary wars, that's the kind of person I would look for, is somebody who is sort of warlike and kind of getting into fights with people. And so the first name that came to mind was Vladimir Putin, and look at this, he actually has almost exactly the planetary war that was going last week with Saturn and Mercury. So this is his chart. So let's backtrack a little bit and start from the beginning. So if this is correct, this is the birth time that was given, but it's not. Oh no, wait, sorry. This is not the birth time that was given, because the birth time that is out on the internet is not confirmed. So what I did was I spun this to the moon, so that this is basically the Chandra Lagna, or the moon rising chart for Vladimir Putin. So from his moon, he is a Taurus, either Taurus, moon rising, ascendant, Lagna, that sort of thing. So his chart is ruled by Venus. Venus has gone to the 6th house. It's in its own sign. So there's some strength there, but the 6th house represents enemies. I wasn't too surprised by that. So he literally goes to the house of enemies. It's almost too funny. You kind of can't, it's just I don't know. I always get sort of, laugh or tickled or sort of amazed, really, because it's I don't even look that hard for these charts. They sort of pop up. I guess that's the Jyotish or the spirit of astrology, the Jyotish that's supporting me. You couldn't, this guy is all about war, in so many ways. But so anyway, the planetary war I mentioned, as you can see, this big blue circle here, there's Sun, there's Saturn, and there's Mercury. So the other thing is Mercury is at the very last degree. And so, it's going to be unstable. But actually, this time, instead of all this happening in Saturn's sign, it's happening in Mercury's sign. So this is going to be a Mercury-dominated planetary war instead of a Saturn-dominated war. The other thing is that, look, if you count the degrees, like I mentioned with planetary combustion, both Saturn and Mercury are within 10 degrees of the Sun. So just like last week, both Saturn and Mercury were combust and at war at the same time. So what does this mean for this kind of guy? And this is the 5th house of intellect for him. So this guy's going to be just in his mind, all about war, all about fighting people, about thoughts and ideas and structure and that sort of technical things, and it's all going to be hidden on the surface. You wouldn't necessarily see this about him. And I think there are pictures, right? Again, I don't follow this, him too much. It's hard not to, even just by reading the headlines, because he's so out there. especially with the, war with Ukraine going on. But, on the surface, he may not present the sort of like warlike energy, but this guy is going to be fighting with words, fighting with bureaucracy. That's like his whole thing. And then the other thing is that, like, if I remember correctly, oh yeah, I did write that over here. Is that the sun is in Hasta nakshatra, which is symbolized by the hand. So he's going to be very hands-on. The sun also represents like authority and leadership, and even things like the king, like the represents sort of the king. So he's going to be the authority in his mind. He's going to be the authority. He's very hands-on. So he's not going to like just sort of be a figurehead and like sit on the throne and, I don't know, eat lovely food or something while everybody else does the work. This guy's going to be in the middle of everything. And Saturn and Mercury are in Chitra nakshatra. And Chitra is like symbolized by a gemstone. So it represents things like structure. So this guy's going to be, and like I often see people who are interested in like design and architecture who have planets in Chitra. So he's an architect of government, of bureaucracy. That's his whole, MO here. The moon, talking about more instability here. The moon, again, and this also gets at sort of the dual nature of this guy that's starting to show itself through where these planetary placements so far. The moon is in Kritika. It's dual in nature. Like on one side, Kartika is like the god of war or something, like he's a celebrated, like victorious soldier. So that's part of his moon or mental energy. But then there's also like kind of a dual nature of Kritika nakshatra, where it also represents, because Kartik was actually raised by a foster mother. So it can also, represent like foster mothers and stuff like that. So again, there's this sort of dual nature where like, there's part of him that's like a warrior, and there's another part of him that can be sort of like nurturing, or at least on the surface seem that way. Venus is in Swati. So, again, Venus went to the house of enemies in his chart. And Swati is represented by like, young, tender grass, like swaying in the wind. I find that people who have Swati placements tend to be, even if they don't show it, they can be kind of nervous, fragile types. So, it's not... so again, we have this, planetary war combustion going on in the 5th house of intellect. We have his mind that's in Kritika. It's a dual-natured vibe for the moon, his mind. The planet that rules his whole chart is in a nakshatra that's very, like, fragile and wavering. So this is not a guy, who's going to offer a lot of stability. And then there's more. So then the Mars, which represents action and warriors and stuff like that, it's in his 9th house, which is like considered probably like the most negative house in some ways. Things like death and chronic disease and bankruptcy, things like that represented by the 9th house. Although esoteric, like actually Jyotish and Ayurveda are represented by the 8th house as well. But his Mars is in Mula. So Mula nakshatra is like all about like is ruled by Kali. So Nitri, which is like the form of Kali, which is like the goddess of death and destruction. So this guy's actions are going to be, the 8th house is deep, and also deep psychology. I mean, this guy's like a basically a minefield. Like you might not, you might see, like you might think you're like walking across this like placid beach or something, like, but then like you step here and like something blows up, and you step like that's it. Okay, and then there's more. So then like Ketu, which is like kind of Mars, that kind of warrior fighting, energy, but there's like a twist to it. So it's like hidden and surprising and sudden. So Ketu is in Ashlesha, is represented by a snake, and Ashlesha energy. You can look at my video from last month. I talked about Ashlesha because we had was it full moon or new moon Ashlesha? It's about biting and sudden and hidden and, and Mars, you can see here, Mars, I have a red arrow. Mars actually aspects 8 houses away. So you have Mars and Mula aspecting Ketu and Ashlesha in the 3rd house of communication. I mean, this guy is going to be like vitriolic, just like spewing venom. Yeah, I mean, it's like you kind of keep hoping like you'll see something like sort of like positive or whatever, but it's just like more and more and more. What else? I have other arrows here. What do I have other arrows? Oh, Jupiter, I believe it's at the end of Aries. It's probably in Kritika. So that can also be the same like the moon, like this kind of dual nature of warrior and nurturing energy. But Jupiter retrograde, there's some strength there. It's aspecting, if you follow the yellow arrow, aspecting Mars. And Jupiter is like expansive energy and like a lot. So it's actually like kind of putting fuel on the Mars fire. So it's going to kind of exaggerate Mars. And the thing is, when you have Jupiter and Mars together, it can also represent law. So again, that's getting back to this whole thing about like administration and authority, leadership, that sort of thing. Oh, and I don't think I mentioned Saturn, which is in this planetary war, combusted with Mercury and Virgo and all this. In his Chandra, this chart, Saturn is the lord of the 10th house of career. It's also the lord of the 9th house of government. So so he's going to be bringing all this chaos to the government. So no surprises there, right? What else is going on? Oh, I also mentioned there's a Bala Rishta. So what is a Bala Rishta? That's a yoga. In Jyotish, we call yogas like planetary combinations. Certain planetary combinations that mean certain things. So in this chart, he's got 4 planets out of 9. So he's got K2 in the 3rd house. That's a negative house. He's got Venus in the 6th house, which is a negative house. He's got Mars in the 8th house, which is a negative house. And he's got Jupiter in the 12th house, which is a negative house. 4 out of the 9 planets are in negative houses. So we call this a Balarishta yoga, when most of the planets, or about half the planets or more, are in negative houses. Usually what that means is that somebody had difficulty in their childhood. It may be that there's actually so much difficulty that they don't survive childhood. But the other thing is that Jupiter and Venus, even though they're in association with each other, they're mutually aspecting each other, all that sort of benevolent energy is like off into the corners, like into these negative houses. So there's not going to be a lot of benefic support here for this guy. The other thing is that his dasha sequence, so the planetary sequence that he grew up in all these like strong energies. So he grew up in Moon, he grew up in Mars, so that, like Mula, destructive, Martian military energy. Rahu is ambition, and then Jupiter, it's so these planets that were pretty malevolent. And then after Jupiter is Saturn, so Moon and Mars, when somebody grows up in those energies, they tend to be very independent, rather than collaborative. So again, there's just kind of more correlation here. So anyway, if you were, just to, again, help you understand in a more kind of concrete way what these astrology phenomena are about, here's an example of planetary war combustion. Vladimir Putin. There you go. Here's another chart. This is Piero Gamba, and you may not have heard of him, but maybe if you were into classical music, you would. He died recently, I think last year. Italian guy, and he was a child prodigy and was leading orchestras, symphony orchestras, from the age of 10. So this is his chart. And he actually also has planetary war in combustion in his chart. So, and look at this. He's got Mercury in Virgo, similar to Putin, but again, in this chart, his rising sign is Virgo. And let's see. Oh, and I also spun this to the moon because I didn't have the first time. But what's nice about this is, as I mentioned, Mercury can shift depending on who it's associated with. The fact that it's with the Venus helps, but it's also with the sun and the moon is a new moon. So Mercury's kind of waffling between whether it wants to be good or bad, benefic or malefic in his chart. But his chart is ruled by Mercury, and he's got 4 planets in Virgo with Mercury, and he's also got Ketu in Gemini in the 10th house. So he's got 5 planets in Mercury signs. This is what we consider not just a Mercury-ruled sign, but a Mercury-dominated chart. So, and again, Mercury rules things like, this is going to be a very detail-oriented person. If you've seen my previous videos, like I talked about, what's her name? It'll come to me in a minute. The woman, she's been quite famous in the last few years. And she's all about like tidying. I'll remember her name in a minute. But I actually looked at her birth chart, and she's a Virgo. I think she's a Virgo rising, or she has Mercury and Virgo in her chart. So this is going to be a very detail-oriented person, a very rational person, organized person. Is a Virgo. They're going to be it's an earth sign. They're going to be very practical and organized. So the other thing is, this guy has moon and sun in Uttar Falguni, which I'm going to get into a little bit more. But this is a nakshatra that represents like pleasurable things. It's represented by by a bed or a hammock. So it's like rest, relaxation, things like the arts, entertainment, that sort of thing. So the sun represents the career, and the moon represents the mind. So there's going to be a lot of the energy in most of his life, filtering through most of his life. What's interesting is that, Venus and Mercury are in Hasta, and I mentioned in the last chart, Hasta is symbolized by the hand. So Venus, which represents the arts, it is symbolized by the hand here, and Mercury is symbolized by the hand. And as a conductor of a symphony, basically his art is to use his hands to organize like musicians. Like, it's kind of cool how this all works out. What's also, the other thing is that when somebody has Mercury in its own sign, or when they have a really strong Mercury, there is a great likelihood that they will become an independent business person and have their own business. So that's essentially what he was, even though he had long-term contracts or gigs with different symphonies around the world. He was essentially working for himself. The other thing is that in this chart, Mercury, aspects directly into the 12th house of Pisces. We talked about Pisces, and Mercury is debilitated there. So even though he was independent, I'm guessing that he probably had a lot of in and outs trying to make that work. And again, because of the planetary wars and stuff, because again, the planetary war happening for him is this big pink circle here. You can see that Venus and Mercury are close to each other. They're only about 12 hours away from being in planetary war. So this is close enough. So basically he's going to be, his perfectionism, his organization, his analytical, rational mind is going to be at odds, actually, with art. And so he might be a very technical, I'm guessing he might be a very technical type of conductor, because again, moon, which also represents arts and intuition, is it's a new moon, so it's not going to be a strong moon. And Venus here, again, dominated by Mercury, at war with Mercury. There's going to be a pull between the head and the heart here, a pull between the rational, intuitive minds, a pull between technique and feeling, mind and emotion. What else is going on here? So the planetary. The other thing is that You can't really tell right now, but actually Mercury's about to go retrograde, so it's going to go back and the sun's going to move forward. So within a few days, I think in less than a week, Mercury's going to be combust. And we talked about what Mercury combust is. What else is going on in this chart? Saturn retrograde in its own sign of Aquarius again. Hello. It's always amazing to me how like these charts that I supposedly randomly come up with like actually, you know, pretty well mimic the current sky pattern. You know, so this is going to be a deeply, deeply, you know, organized guy. That's more of that. It's also, you can see the blue arrow here. It's mutually aspecting Mars. You know, Mars is innovation, that sort of thing. Saturn is perseverance. So when you get these two together, you're going to get somebody who's like an athlete. And for him, you know, just to do what he does over and over and over again, like using his hands and conducting people in orchestras, like, you know, that's a lot. You're going to need a lot of movement, action, and resilience to do that. What else? Mars is in Magha nakshatra, so Magha is like a throne or like a like authority position. And Mars is aspecting 4 houses away into the 3rd house of arts, classical arts. So he's like king, you know, it's like the throne or king of classical arts. Jupiter can represent, you know, especially like oral activities and speaking and stuff like that. So, you know, he had to use his voice really to organize and conduct. Besides his hands, he had to use that to get, you know, the orchestra working together. What else? Jupiter is in Jyesta nakshatra. Jyesta can be like sort of the organizer or enforcer. Like sometimes it can represent things like law enforcement, that sort of thing. So again, that's what he was doing. He was like all of this, or he's like basically imposing and leading others through like organization, all this like detail management, that sort of thing. And it was kind of interesting too, is that he also grew up in a similar dasha sequence, or the same dasha sequence as Vladimir Putin. So Moon, Mars, Rahu, Jupiter. Moon and Mars is going to be a very independent person. But, you know, again, the moon is not strong here for him, but it's in his 1st house of personality and self. So he was already developing very early on, you know, being seen. Mars, you know, again, independent, initiative, that sort of thing. Rahu, is, you know, his drive and ambition. So anyway, a different chart, different kind of career, but, you know, again, you can kind of see the planetary energies, especially as like a 10-year-old prodigy. He was going to have to break through. He was going to have to prove himself and break through and prove himself, like have the chutzpah, confidence, or whatever, wherewithal to say, yeah, I'm 10 years old, but I can still lead this orchestra. Like that's going to take a lot. So you're going to have, you know, a fighting spirit. But because of the planets here, and where they're located, and even like the nakshatras and stuff that they're in, this is going to be a much more mild version than like what Vladimir Putin is showing up with. All right, so the moon. Let's talk about the moon. March 7th, yesterday, there was a full moon in Leo, or Purva Falguni Nakshatra. So whenever there's a full moon, it's kind of this juicy, robust, bright, clear, intuitive, sensual, creative, you know, culmination energy. It's kind of like the buffet table. The moon is full and juicy. It brings a lot of good energy. The symbol of Purva Falguni is the better hammock. The deity of it is Bhaga, or the god that represents conjugal bliss and wealth, or it can also be the Shiva Lingam, which is a symbol of Shiva, and also, again, sexuality, that sort of thing. Conjugal bliss, I guess. Excuse me. So the energy of this nakshatra is like sweet speech, charitableness, rest, relaxation, enjoyment, love, affection. Yes, like this is a sweet nakshatra. sexual passion and pleasure, carefreeness, relying on luck. There can be a little bit of impulsiveness or impetuousness here, because again, it's just sort of like loose and carefree. you know, the opposite of like mula or chitra. There can be some inertia, like getting started or following through, because again, this person is just in a good mood and wants to feel good. Like they may not be like super organized depending on what planets are here. It can represent things like creative arts, fame, charisma, health, once in a while possible accidents. So things like music, musicians. So again, we were just looking at Piero Gamba's chart. His planets were not in Purva Falguni, but Uttara Falguni, which is similar. So again, musician, that's what he is. And using his hands, right? In a very like organized, detailed way. Creative artist, rest, relaxation, vacations, entertainment. So this, you know, just like we saw with Piero Gamba, like that was his life. It was about creating beautiful music and sharing that with people and like enhancing their life with like this, you know, very sensual and beautiful and relaxing, you know, art form. Yeah, it can also represent things like theater, cinema, classical music, again, Piero Gamba, dressing up and going out, marriage, sex therapist, that sort of thing. So you get the vibe here. Like it's a very sensual, sort of luxurious nakshatra. And we had a full moon, so probably, you know, which is nice because it is also like we're still sort of in that energy today with Holi. So people are probably feeling pretty good, you know, for the most part. Again, everybody's in different planetary periods right now. They got different things going on, but overall, the vibe, sort of planet-wise, is probably pretty good. Coming up at the end of the month, on March 21st, we have a new moon in Pisces in Uttara Prajapada nakshatra. So new moons, it's the opposite. So dry, timid, suspicious, fragile, confusion in the mind. It's about kind of plowing under things that are no longer serving and kind of planting new seeds for a new cycle. The symbol of this is the back legs of a funeral cot. I don't want to go into this too much because I went into it last month, but basically the deity of this is Ahir, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, Ahir Budnya, which is serpent of the deep. So the reason why I put all this here is because this is like a very different energy from Purva Falguni. So things are going to shift at the end of the month. Like, this is like cruel, deformed, depraved energy. Not as much as Purva Bradapada, but there's you can see there's already like a big contrast between this and Purva Falguni. This can be like a self-sacrificing person. There can be benefits through gifts, donations, inheritance, movement. It can be seclusion and secrecy because again, snake, they hide out in caves. Solitude, retirement, Kundalini Shakti, spiritual evolution. Well, the thing is, like, this new moon is happening in Pisces, so it's happening in Jupiter sign with Jupiter. So more of the spiritual related stuff, like spiritual evolution, like maybe towards the end of the month. And this is right before Navaratri starts. Like, somebody might have this sort of intuitive drive or need or thing to like even just take a day off to get quiet and tune in, maybe something more extensive than that, but the more spiritual, or maybe start on some new, spiritual thing, like maybe a new sadhana or new daily spiritual practice or something like that. Maybe do 10 minutes of yoga a day, it could be something like that. Spiritual evolution, wisdom, knowledge, enlightenment, CDs, so these can be like spiritual powers that are developed through your sadhana spiritual practice, great devotees, renouncing the world, insight, intellect awareness, but there's like something, again, with the new moon, some old cycles sort of ending or dying, especially since, the symbol here is the back legs of the funeral, but something new, there might be some new spiritual or charitable activity that started from this, at the end of the month. So yesterday was party time, and then it's sort of like, go deeper at the end of the month with the moon and where the mind is at. And so, I put together the chart for the full moon that happened yesterday. This is the first chart here. This is at 7:40 a.m. Eastern Standard Time yesterday. And you can see, like, Pisces happens to be, we've been talking about Pisces happens to be the lugna, the rising sign for that moment, when it was an exact alignment between the sun and the moon. And we have here Jupiter, Venus in Pisces, both benefics. Jupiter's strong, not only because it's on its own sign, but it has what we call digbal, or directional strength, being in the first house. Venus is exalted. I mean, this is like, beautiful. The wise counselor, the mundane counselor, they're together. There's going to be a lot of wisdom here. But there's also, like, look at this. I talked about Balarishta in previous charts. This chart has Mars in the 3rd house, Moon in the 6th house, Sun, Mercury, Saturn in the 12th house. That's 5 planets that are in negative houses. So we have a Balarishta here. And actually, in a way, like if this was a person's chart, it's not quite clear whether this... Oh, and then Ketu's in the 8th house. So actually you have 6 planets out of 9, in negative houses. So if this is a person's chart, this might be somebody who actually doesn't survive childhood or infancy or something like that. But they would still be such a light and bring in joy and heightened spirituality and that sort of thing. Because Jupiter and Venus are in Revati, which is a really nice, beautiful, gentle energy. Hospitality is there, travel, that sort of thing. But I think it really fits with the whole kind of deeper concept of Holi. I know, like, with Holi, most people just, they concentrate or focus on all the, like, beautiful colors and powders and stuff that they throw on each other and, run around with your friends and, just have fun with it. But, the deeper aspect of Holi is that what you really want to do before you throw color on yourself, yourself or others, and have fun, which is great, is that the real point of it is to let go of old grievances and grudges and negative energy, that you have with others. And by letting that old stuff go, letting that die away, what it does is it creates space, in your mind and heart, spirit, body, to allow, like, fresh energy to come in, fresh color to come in. And so in a way, even though this chart may seem contradictory, it is really about, like, a fresh, bright, new energy, and things also dying away at the same time. And then, and it's got the, same thing going on, Sun, Mercury, Saturn, and all of this, like Sun, Mercury, Saturn is all aspecting the moon, so the mind, and Mars is also aspecting the mind. So there's still, like, there's a lot of, and the moon is in the 6th house of enemies and stuff. So again, this might be a lot about, like, really re-engineering thoughts about enemies, people you have grievances with. That's what I'm seeing here. And then look at the chart right next to it, and I put a little question mark here. And you can see there's a lot of, similarities. Like you have Venus and Jupiter right across from each other, across the 1-7 axis here. You got Mars in the 3rd house, same. You have Mercury, Saturn, Sun in the 12th house, same. Moon is not in the 6th house, but it's now in the 8th house. So there's a lot of similarities here. And, if you've been paying attention, you might actually recognize that this is Vladimir Putin's chart, which I already went through. But the thing here is that all I did was actually, I put this, it's the same chart, I just rotate it to the proposed birth time that's out there on the internet, even though it's not been confirmed. But what was, so striking to me was, in so many ways, it looks like this holy, like this full moon chart. It's really uncanny, but the thing is, like, these planets are in different energies, So from a surface level, it looks similar, but when you start digging in deeper into like the nakshatras, especially, that's why I like to do nakshatra astrology. It's a whole different vibe, and in a way, Vladimir Putin's chart, he's still got the Balarishta, even when you spin his chart this way. There's going to be a lot of loss, and in some way, it may not seem like it, but that's sort of like the dual nature of how we perceive the world. There are good guys and bad guys and that sort of thing. And the thing is, it's all energy. It all is coming from the same universe. And the thing is, it's like the only way to have good guys is to have bad guys. The only way to have hot is to have cold. And the thing is, I remember back when I was attending services at the Vedanta Society when I lived in Chicago, was there was something on the news, like the Swami was always talking about, like, oh, God is everywhere, God is everywhere. And I'm watching the news, this is Chicago, and like some kid was found tied to a bed, chained to a bed or something like that on the news. I found it very disturbing. So I go to the Swami at the next, service, and I said, so Swami, I saw in the news there was a kid tied to a bed. Somebody did that, and like you keep talking about like God is everywhere. Like, where's God in that? And I'm sure a lot of people, especially with the Ukraine situation going on, so many things going on in the world, they wonder like, how is this possible? How is this good in any way? What the Swami told me is like, you don't really know the trajectory of this individual. Like, maybe this kid, because they were tied to a bed, maybe they end up becoming one of the greatest child advocates or child, protection lawyers, in the world. You can't really determine from, eyesight at this moment what this really means in the long term. So, it's kind of getting more at the kind of the spiritual aspects of Jyotish. Again, it's all kind of energy and it's all karma. And so, as we let go of grievances in the other, that's the thing, is we're all connected. And it's when we're letting go of grievances and old energy, we're actually sort of also releasing our old karmas. Because our karma, again, based on Jyotish philosophy, is what created these situations. So if you get into a situation that's negative, rather than augment that situation by getting angry and lashing out and, going for revenge or what have you, if it's possible, and it may not always be possible, it's hard to do, when you're really emotional. But if you really sink into and meditate about we're all connected and we're all one, what does that really mean? Is that whenever some negative situation comes up, it's actually a result of our previous karmas. And we may not know what these karmas are. They might have been in past lives, but when we're letting go of old energy for, quote unquote, another person, we're actually letting go of old energy towards ourselves and things that we might have done unknowingly that created this particular karma. And so with more sitting and meditating and contemplation, it stops the cycle, because instead of getting angry and lashing out and saying a few things or doing a few things or thinking a few things that are negative, we take it back to ourselves and we're like, okay, there's more stuff for me to clean up in my own mind, in my own life. How can I do better? If I have issues with colleagues at work, for example, how do I change my thoughts and actions to create more positive karma moving forward? So it's actually a deep practice, but again, when people show up as villains in our lives, that's where that's it's so funny. It's like this trucks don't go by, and it just kind of honked. Maybe that was an exclamation point from the universe, but that's where we can start changing things, changing our own thoughts, because you can't have a violent action without a violent thought. So even if you think negatively, but you don't say anything or do anything, from both a yoga standpoint as well as a Jyotish standpoint, that's something to be worked on. And how do we shift that? And again, when we, even through like Holi or something, if we do spend time like trying to let go of old grievances and grudges and stuff towards people, we're actually letting go of grievances and grudges towards ourselves and the things that we've done or said or thought in the past that created the negative karma to begin with. And once you really step into that perspective and work from that perspective, then when stuff happens, it's like you kind of like, there's a reflex like, oh, that didn't feel good. But then it's like, okay, it gives you insight into where to go within yourself to start changing, to again create a new pathway of different karma, fresh karma. So there you go. So there is light even within the darkness, essentially. Okay, Rahu and Venus. I skipped this last month, but Rahu is entered Ashwini nakshatra February 20th, so over a week ago. The symbol of this is a horse's head. The deity is Ashwini Kumaras, which are heroic twins, physicians of the gods. So Ashwini nakshatra, the energy here is like medical miracles, twins, anything equine or related to horses, transportation, movement, speed, again, horse movement, transportation. Initiative of action can be kind of hurried and inefficient because, again, there can be so much energy, it's not smooth. Can be happy-go-lucky, lively intelligence, medicine, healing, helping, heroism. There's a lot of, charge here, a lot of forward movement here. Charm, elegance, popularity, extravagance, courage, law enforcement, army, athletes, physicians, chemists. You get the vibe here. So there's a lot of action, fiery energy. Because again, we're already in Aries, which is ruled by Mars, a fiery planet. But Ashwini itself is a very fiery type of energy. And Rahu is a planet that represents unexpected, sudden changes. So you might see more sudden changes in terms of this sort of thing, sudden healing with maybe a long-term medical problem, or it could be sudden issues with law enforcement, or what could it be? Sudden travel or difficulty with travel, that sort of thing. Because again, Rahu is a malevolent planet, so again, there's going to be twists and turns, but also this fiery energy here. And then on March 11th, Venus is also entering Aries, Misha, and Ashwini. So then you kind of can take Venus as a planet, what it represents. So things like spouse, loved ones, vehicles. So there might be some travel or things like that. It can also represent things like the arts. So I would think there could be some unexpected issues with travel for yourself or somebody else. There could be new developments or insights related to the arts. It might be that your spouse or loved one is involved with things like that. But something new and something kind of unexpected. And then the thing is, on March 21st, Venus is crossing Rahu. And this is at the same time when we have the new moon and also the equinox. So March 21st, is going to be a little bit unstable. So, again, slow your roll. Take things, a day at a time, minute at a time. Give people a little bit space. But, especially with Venus crossing Rahu, there's probably going to be some unexpected fallout. Some unexpected fallout or, thing related to vehicles, transport, sudden shows of action, that sort of thing. again, it could also be like just sudden improvement as well, because Ashwini, Venus is the kind of mundane counselor. So it might be you find some alternative medicine practitioner who suddenly helps you heal something that you never thought was going to be healed. That could also come from this. Some sort of mundane counselor who just, because Ashwini Kumara, again, they're, physicians of the gods. So something unexpected is bound to happen around March 21st. And then what happens? And then Venus is going to enter Bharani nakshatra on March 23rd. So just after this, sort of unexpected turn happens, it's going to slip into this energy. The symbol of Bharani is the vulva, and the deity is Yama, the god of death. So this is also a pretty intense, nakshatra. It's like, it represents things like internal struggles, personal breakthroughs, triumph, revolution, life, death, jealousy, purification, nurturing, food, hospitality, confinement, because of the, the uterus, confines like children as they're growing inside you. Restraint, the arts, entertainment, children, power, law, politics. So there may be, again, Venus is a benefic, and we're talking about the vulva here. Venus represents medical issues like gynecological issues. So it might be somebody suddenly gets pregnant, unexpectedly gets pregnant. That's a possibility. It could be that you have sudden, because again, Venus was just in Ashwini, represented by the Ashwini Kumaras, the physicians of the gods, and now we're talking about like the uterus here. There could be something like some sort of sudden healing or breakthrough regarding relationship with spouse or sexuality or the sexual system of the body, that sort of thing. And again, there's still like this law enforcement thing going on in both of these nakshatras, and Venus also represents women. So unfortunately, it could also mean like something pops up in the news regarding some unexpected law or regulation related to women. And well, that's kind of going on. I mean, with like birth control and stuff in the United States. So there could be some new event or, something that happens that's going to push all of that struggle or conversation along. Yeah, so you can kind of see the energies here. So again, Venus, there's potential for Venus to do a lot of healing, but there are also going to be twists and turns related to Venus. So, again, most people are interested in Venus because it represents spouse and loved ones and that sort of thing. So, there you go. Then Mars, Sun, Saturn are doing some transits on March 12th. Mars enters Gemini after almost 6 months in Taurus. That was a huge long period for Mars in Taurus. So you're going to start seeing some forward movement, but the thing is, Gemini is an air sign, so it's going to be more in the idea of the realm of ideas. Mars is inimical in Gemini. It's also a dual sign. So Mars might be struggling a little bit, to come up with new ideas. Like once it's kind of gotten past the inertia barrier to move forward, but now it's got to kind of rethink what direction it wants to take before it actually, gets some more solid, some traction, I guess. So again, Mars entering Gemini or Mithuna is all about initiating new ideas, possibly actions, from both an idealistic and practical point of view, because Mars is also aspecting into Virgo, which we've talked a lot about Virgo today. So it's an earth sign, practical, but also about getting things done. It's going to be aspecting into Sagittarius, which is a very, fiery, philosophical rashi constellation, and also Capricorn, which is a very practical earth sign as well. So, but again, there's going to be some contradiction. So it might be like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. March 14th, a couple days later, Sun enters Pisces. So we're going to bring some energy to Pisces. It's going to be there with Jupiter, so that should be nice. Bring some probably good vibes to work and have vitality, general energy. As I mentioned, Pisces is a water sign, it's a dual sign, it's neutral, so the sun should do okay here. So there should be more purpose and vitality related to both emotional and mundane worlds, because this is also aspecting Sun, and Jupiter are going to be aspecting into Virgo. But there's also going to be this like multiple kind of contradictory energy too, because Pisces is a dual sign. So, but probably better off than being in Aquarius with Saturn. It's going to be a little bit more touchy-feely, warm and fuzzy energy, even if it's not the most efficient or forward-moving, clear forward-moving energy. Also, the same day Saturn enters Shatabisha nakshatra. Shatabisha might be a tough placement for Saturn. Unfortunately, for some people, this could mean like possible slow, chronic neuromuscular diseases that are difficult to detect or cure. So some people might be getting ill, especially depending on which house this is happening in for them. It might also be that the energy of Shatabisha is like kind of more of a solitary, visionary, meditative, protective energy. So, and Saturn is the planet that represents like isolation and distance and stuff like that. So, if people are really in a Saturn, planetary period, or Saturn is really important for them in their chart, they may not feel like being that social. They might be keeping themselves a little bit, trying to get some clarity. Again, the whole theme, I think, of this month is getting clarity so that you can start to make movement forward. So, that's going to be Saturn. And then the end of the month, March 27th, Mars enters Ardra nakshatra. So it's still in Gemini, but Ardra, the symbol here is like a lightning storm or a teardrop. So it's like stormy, and the deity is Rudra, the storm god. So there can be sudden transformative action here. Like just like a lightning bolt, like sort of out of the blue, very quick, decisive. It can also represent loss or disappointment. So as Mars is moving through these different ideas, represented by Gemini, it might start to take some action, or some of the action it might take is like, okay, what do I let go of so I can start doing these other things I do want to start doing. It can also represent things like chemistry, heat, electricity. So it might even be something like if Gemini represents your fourth house of house and Mars is there now, you might be like upgrading or making some changes with the heat or electricity in your home. It can vary, sort of mundane and practical that way. But there's probably some, again, sudden movement, action that's taken at the end of the month. That might, and it won't, there may be some loss or disappointment, but, storms, like it depends on your perspective, as all things, right? Like in India, or, I remember being in India and in Rajasthan, and, there was, this huge storm coming through. It like flooded the area, and people were like dancing because it's like brought rain. Like they finally brought some rain to the desert, So it's not necessarily all bad, but there's probably some drama, unexpected thing coming through at the end of the month, which again corresponds with these planets starting to move into Aries and Ashwini and Bharani, right now is sort of the calm before the storm, but things may get a little bit stormy at the end of the month. Mercury, the planet that represents thoughts, rational thought, and analysis, decision making. I talked about the planetary war that happened with Saturn last week, March 1st through 3rd. On the 16th, Mercury enters Pisces. We talked about that. It's debilitated, it's a water sign. Mercury doesn't do super great in Pisces, but at least Jupiter's with it, so that will help a bit. But again, it might be this kind of wishy-washy back and forth decision making, emotion. It might be kind of emotional. You might be kind of struggling between emotional thought and more analytical aspects. But it's also going to aspect Virgo. So whatever Virgo represents in your chart will probably work pretty well. because Mercury's exalted there, it's in its own sign, and then you have this, SWA Jupiter also aspecting. So Virgo, whatever Virgo represents, will probably work really efficiently and organized, along mundane lines. I also talked about at the end of the month, March 27th through 28th, there's going to be planetary with Jupiter. So mild, but some sort of probably scuffle about words or thoughts or ideas, philosophies, that sort of thing. And the very last day of the month, Mercury enters Aries, Ashwini, and leaves combustion. So we're moving into a fiery, mutable sign, or a cardinal sign, and it's an enemy. So again, Mercury's not going to do great here, but you might finally start making some decisions, right or wrong. Start making some headway instead of just being in your head and ruminating and contemplating and all that kind of stuff. So at least sometimes, like they say, it's like better to take a step, take any step rather than just sit and think and not take any action. So there might be that going on at the end of the month as well. So more fire, more action. So, you can look at your own chart. You can get free charts online, a bunch of places. But the houses you really want to look at are like where's Pisces and probably Aries as well. I mean, it's a little bit early. We're going to definitely get more Aries energy next month. But, find Pisces in your chart and see what it relates to. Like the first house or bhava is self, personality, health, and reputation. So if Pisces is in your first house, this is where a lot of the energies are going to play out this month. So you can read through on your own here. And then these are the other houses to consider once you figure out which house Pisces is in your own chart. So you can get some more idea, for your own life, what's going on this month. So there you have it. Transits for the month, energies that are going to be playing out, shifts that are going to be happening. I hope you found this useful, helpful, interesting, and I hope it helps you navigate the energies coming up in the next few weeks. So until the next time, take care. Namaste.